caught my wife cheating, moved on, and found new love. But what I never expected was that my ex would charge at me and my new girlfriend in a fit of jealous rage. Imagine stumbling upon a message so shocking that it shatters everything you thought you knew about your life. That's exactly what happened to me when I accidentally saw a text on my husband's phone that revealed a betrayal so deep it left me breathless. In that moment, all the years of trust, love, and memories we had built together seemed to crumble to dust. The man I thought I knew, the father of my children, was hiding a secret so dark, it made me question everything. The message wasn't just a sign of infidelity. It was a glimpse into a relationship I never saw coming, one that had been thriving right under my nose. How could someone I trusted so much betray me in such a cruel and twisted way? The discovery was just the beginning of a journey that would change my life forever. When I first met Paul, I was convinced that I had found the man I would spend the rest of my life with. We built a life together, a family, and for the longest time, I believed that our marriage was as solid as the house we lived in. But that moment, the moment I saw the text on his phone, turned my world upside down. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. How had I been so blind? The shock didn't come from the affair itself, though that was bad enough. No, it was the realization that all these years, Paul had been secretly mocking me, belittling me behind my back. I had always trusted him, always believed in us, but now, every sweet word he ever whispered seemed like a lie. How could I have been so naive? As I scrolled through the messages between him and Amy, my heart shattered with each word. They didn't just talk about an affair, they talked about me, how I was old, boring, and out of touch with the world, like some kind of burden on his life. Their cruelty was unmasking a side of Paul I never imagined existed. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a betrayal of who I was. Every laugh they shared at my expense felt like a stab in the heart. And then it hit Mesh wasn't just his lover. She had become the person he preferred over me, his own wife. The woman who once cared for him, loved him, and helped build a family was nothing more than a joke to him now. I wanted to confront him, to scream, to tear apart everything he had done to me, but I was paralyzed. The realization that the man I had been living with for nearly 2 decades had been living a double life was unbearable. The pain of betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was suffocating, consuming me in a way I never thought possible. The silence between us now felt heavier than ever. In the days that followed, the weight of what I had discovered crushed me like a relentless storm. Each day, I walked through our home, and everything's wrong tainted. The pictures on the walls, the smell of our old house, even the way the sunlight fell through the curtains seemed to mock me. My mind couldn't stop replaying the words I had read, the cruel texts, the laughter they shared at my expense. It was as if my entire life, everything I had built with Paul, was nothing more than a house of cards, ready to collapse. I wasn't just grieving an affair, I was mourning the death of my self-worth. I wanted to confront him immediately, demand answers, but the anger inside me was so fiery, I feared I might lose control. Paul, the man I had trusted, had reduced me to a joke, and I wasn't sure how to even begin picking up the pieces. When he came home, there was an eerie calmness in the air, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, everything had to change. The facade we had carefully built together was gone, and I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't keep up the act of the perfect family while he tore apart my heart behind closed doors. And yet, as I stood there, staring at him across the room, my chest tightening with fury, I realized something else. This wasn't just about me. It was about our children, our future. I couldn't let this man, who had treated me so callously, be the father of my kids. My world had been shattered, but I had to keep my head together for them. I needed to take action. I had to decide what came next, and it wasn't going to be easy. What was more painful, confronting him or walking away for good? The decision loomed over me, dark and heavy, like an avalanche waiting to fall. The night of the confrontation came sooner than I expected. Paul came home late, just like he always did, his briefcase in hand and a tired look on his face. But this time, there was no comfort in his familiar presence. I could feel the distance between us like a thick wall, and every step he took toward me only made it feel more suffocating. I had never felt more alone, even though we were standing in the same room. His usual smile, once warm, once comforting, was gone. The man I had shared my life with, the father of my children, had become a stranger. He barely noticed my silence as he set down his briefcase and began to make small talk, oblivious to the storm that was raging inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stand pretending. "We need to talk," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though my hands were trembling. Paul froze, his eyes shifting nervously, like he knew exactly what was coming. He didn't ask what about. He didn't need to. As I showed him the texts, the cruel words, the proof of his betrayal, his face morphed from confusion to guilt, and then, shockingly, to anger. "You're reading too much into this," he said, his voice rising, almost panicked. He tried to dismiss everything, to downplay it like it was nothing. But I saw through it. I saw the man he had become, the liar, the coward who was afraid of facing the truth. The person standing before me wasn't the man I had loved, the man I had trusted with my heart. He tried to argue, to deflect, but it was no use. Each word I spoke was a dagger, each accusation a blow that he couldn't dodge. And then it happened, he snapped. His voice grew louder, more aggressive, the anger bubbling over. "Why are you doing this? Why can't you just leave it?" The desperation in his eyes terrified me. It was no longer about the affair. It was about control. He had already lost me. But in that moment, he lost something far worse: his own mind. I stood there, trying to keep calm, but the fear was real now. He was unraveling before my eyes. His response wasn't just about guilt. It was about a man whose carefully constructed life was slipping away, and he couldn't handle it. My heart pounded in my chest. But this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about taking back what was mine, about not letting him destroy me or my children any longer. The decision was made. I would not be the victim here. Not anymore. The confrontation wasn't just about exposing his lies. It was the beginning of my fight for freedom. The tension in the room was unbearable as Paul continued to shout, desperately trying to convince me that I was overreacting, that it wasn't as bad as I thought. But the more he spoke, the more I realized that he wasn't sorry. He wasn't even ashamed. His words were empty, his apologies hollow. His attempts to manipulate me felt like another betrayal, a continuation of the lies that had been eating away at our marriage for years. And yet, his anger wasn't just about the affair. It was about losing control over me, about me finally seeing him for who he truly was. I had expected him to beg for forgiveness, to apologize profusely and promise to make things right. Instead, I saw the man I had once loved turn into a stranger. His face twisted with frustration, his voice sharp with accusation. "Why can't you just forget this?" he spat, his eyes wild. The fury in his voice sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't the man I had married. He was a man who had completely abandoned the idea of love, respect, and family. And in that moment, I realized that my marriage had been a facade. All this time, I had been living with a person who had been slowly erasing me, piece by piece, from his life. The realization hit me like a freight train. I had been so desperate to hold on to the idea of our family, to the memory of the love we once shared. But that love was gone, buried under layers of lies, deceit, and cruelty. As I stared at him, my heart racing, I knew that there was no going back. There was nothing left to salvage. The man standing before me wasn't the man I had built a life with. And yet, despite the storm of emotions crashing inside me, a sense of clarity washed over me. I had to protect myself, protect my children, and break free from this toxic relationship. The fight for my dignity had only just begun. I was done being manipulated, done being the one who always forgave, always put others first. For the first time, I was putting myself first. It was time to move on, to reclaim my life from the wreckage he had left behind. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to walk. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur of raw emotions and chaotic thoughts. I had made the decision, but the weight of it all felt heavier with each passing hour. Paul was no longer the man I had loved. That much was clear. But what came next, what I had to face, was far more terrifying than any argument we'd ever had. It was about the consequences of my decision. The ripple effect of ending a marriage I had poured my heart into for almost 2 decades. I couldn't shake the image of Paul's face when he realized that I wasn't going to back down. It was the look of a man who knew he was losing everything, and in a sick way, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered everything he had done, how he'd betrayed me, how he had turned our family into a joke for his own amusement. I had been so wrapped up in holding on to a broken past that I hadn't seen the destruction he had been causing all along. And now I was ready to make the hardest choice of my life. I had to tell Eric. The thought of breaking his heart made me physically ill. How do you tell your son that the man he looked up to, the man who was supposed to be his hero, was nothing more than a liar and a cheater? The fear of shattering his world, of seeing that look of disbelief and pain in his eyes, nearly stopped me in my tracks. But I knew I had no choice. The truth had to come out, no matter how much it hurt. I sat down with Eric in the living room, my hands trembling as I tried to find the right words. "Eric," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "There's something you need to know about your father." The moment I spoke those words, I could see the shift in his face, his confusion, his growing concern. And then, the heartbreak, the rage. It was all there, a storm brewing in his eyes. The pain of seeing my son's world collapse in front of him was almost unbearable, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore, I was protecting him. I had been living a lie for so long, pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Now, I had to show him that the truth, no matter how painful, was always the way forward. It was time for both of us to heal, to rebuild our lives, even if it meant tearing down everything we thought we knew. As Eric stormed out of the room, hurt and angry, I felt the weight of my decision settle in. I had opened the floodgates, and there was no turning back now. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the wreckage of the past. It would be a long, painful journey, but it was one I was ready to face. For myself, for my children, for our future. The days that followed were a blur of guilt, fear, and raw emotion. I had shattered my son's world, and I couldn't shake the image of his face, the disbelief, the anger, the way he walked out of the room like a storm had just passed through. It was as if everything I had tried to protect him from had exploded in one painful moment. Eric, my baby boy, who had trusted his father so blindly, was now seeing the man he admired for who he truly was: a liar, a cheater, a coward. The guilt was suffocating, and the weight of it nearly crushed me. But I knew, deep down, it was the right thing to do. I had to tell him the truth. The truth always comes out, one way or another. I tried to give Eric space, but the silence between us grew unbearable. He refused to talk to me for days, his coldness cutting deeper than any words ever could. I understood his pain, his confusion, but I also knew that this was the beginning of his journey to understanding. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about his future, about the man he was going to become. And I couldn't let him think that it was okay for someone to treat him like this, that he should accept lies and betrayal in the name of keeping the peace. I had to face Paul next, and this time I wasn't afraid. The man who had tried to manipulate me into staying, the one who had acted as though I were the problem, was about to see that I had nothing left to lose. I walked into the living room with my head held high, determined to no longer be a victim of his cruelty. His reaction was one of panic. Of course, he could see that I was no longer the woman he could control. His threats, his desperate attempts to manipulate, fell flat. I wasn't listening anymore. Not to him. Not to his lies. "I'm done, Paul," I said, my voice steady despite the fury bubbling inside me. The room felt like it was closing in on us, but I refused to back down. "You will never control me again." I had drawn the line. The path forward would be difficult, but for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of strength ignite inside me. I was no longer afraid. I was free. The silence in the house was deafening after my confrontation with Paul. He had been stunned at first, unable to comprehend that I wasn't backing down. His usual tactics of denial and deflection no longer worked on me. I had taken my stand, and there was no turning back. But as the days passed, the weight of what I had done, what I was about to do, began to sink in. The divorce papers. The real, irreversible step that would officially end everything we had built together. I spent hours alone in the kitchen, the papers in front of me, trying to gather the courage to sign them. The thought of walking away from a marriage that had once meant everything to me was suffocating. But with every passing moment, the pain of his betrayal outweighed the love I had once held for him. I had thought for years that I could save this, that we could work through our problems. But how could I rebuild something that had been so broken from the start? The sound of Paul's voice broke my thoughts, a frantic call from the other room. "You can't do this!" he shouted, his voice laced with panic. "We're family! You're tearing us apart!" His words felt empty now, as hollow as the life we had shared. He was grasping at straws, trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. His anger was palpable, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. He was unraveling, and I knew then that I was no longer dealing with just a man who had betrayed me. I was dealing with someone who was afraid of losing control, someone willing to fight for that control with everything he had left. The man who had betrayed me was now trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty for doing the one thing that would set me free. "I'm not running away, Paul," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I'm taking back my life." But as I stood there, the panic in his eyes became clear. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. The threats started subtle at first, like an undercurrent of menace. He accused me of destroying our family, of ruining everything for the sake of a petty revenge. The cruel twist in his voice made my blood run cold, and for a moment I felt my resolve begin to shake. Was this really happening? Was this how far he would go to avoid facing the consequences of his actions? I couldn't afford to show weakness. I had to remain calm, to be strong for myself, for our children. This wasn't just about the divorce anymore, it was about my survival. With every word he shouted, I realized that I was no longer afraid of him. I was no longer afraid of losing him. What I feared now was the man he had become, the man I would never allow near my life again. The path ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back. I had made my choice, and I was ready to fight. As Paul's voice grew louder, more desperate, I felt a cold rush of reality flood over me. This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. It was about control, manipulation, and his refusal to accept the end of everything we had built together. His threats escalated, laced with venom. He painted me as the villain in a story that he had twisted beyond recognition. "You'll regret this," he warned, his words slicing through the air. "I'll make sure of it." But I stood my ground, the trembling fear in my chest quickly transforming into a fierce determination. For the first time, I realized just how much I had been living in fear of him. His manipulation, his lies, they had kept me trapped for so long, doubting myself, questioning my worth. But now, I wasn't that person anymore. I was done with the constant mental games, done with the empty promises and the gaslighting. "I won't regret this," I said, my voice steady and strong. "I'm doing what's best for me and for our kids. This is the only way forward." His face contorted in disbelief. For a moment, I saw the man he had once been, the man I had married, the man I had trusted. But that man was gone, swallowed whole by the lies he had woven around himself. The man standing before me was nothing but a stranger, someone I could no longer recognize. His words became even more frantic as he tried to regain control, but I had already made my decision. The kids needed me to be strong, to show them that they could rise above this chaos. They couldn't grow up in a house filled with lies and manipulation. Not anymore. The day I filed for divorce, I could feel the weight of the world shift. As I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I clicked "Submit" on the divorce papers, I thought about everything that led up to this moment. The years of pretending, the gaslighting, the hurtful words, the betrayal, it all came crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I knew in my heart that this was the only path forward, but it still felt like a betrayal of its own. Betraying a life I had fought so hard to build, a family I had poured my soul into. The truth was, I was terrified, not just of the unknown, but of the mess that Paul would undoubtedly make of it. His anger, his need for control, his refusal to accept responsibility, everything about him screamed that he would not let this go quietly. I could almost hear his voice in my head, threatening me, manipulating me with his venomous words. "You're making a huge mistake," he would say. "You're going to regret this." But I couldn't go back. The man I had loved was gone, replaced by a version of him I never saw coming. I wasn't just divorcing him. I was divorcing a shadow of the man I thought I knew. The man who had stood by my side for years was now a stranger, someone capable of unimaginable betrayal. The hardest part wasn't signing the papers, though. It wasn't even facing the anger or the resentment from Paul. The hardest part was the fear I felt for my children. How would Eric take this? Would this destroy him? Would Mary ever forgive me for unraveling their world? I feared the pain they would carry, but deep down, I knew this was the right decision. They needed to see strength, not weakness. They needed to see that no matter how broken the family seemed, they deserved a future free from deceit. I called my lawyer, ready to take the next steps. My hands were still shaking, but my heart was resolute. There was no turning back now. This was my chance to rebuild. And I was going to fight for that future, no matter what. The moment I handed Paul the divorce papers, I knew everything had changed forever. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words, as Paul's eyes darkened with rage. He slammed the papers down. But it wasn't the act that terrified, it was the shift in him. Gone was the man I once knew. In his place stood someone consumed by anger and desperation. His voice, usually calm, now shook with a venomous fury. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you're doing," he spat. His words were like poison, but they no longer held any power over me. I had broken free, and no matter how much he tried to claw back, I wasn't going to be his victim anymore. But as I watched him fall apart, I couldn't ignore the fear that gripped me. The anger in his eyes wasn't just about losing mate, was about losing control. And control was the one thing he couldn't stand to give up. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of my decision, but it was no longer a burden, it was liberation. I had taken the first step toward freedom. I wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time, I was ready to face whatever came next. The future was mine to shape, and I would fight for it.